Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. Today, as promised, I'll be painting another bird and there's more to come. But real quick, I just wanted to show you, I think that maybe this is our last blast of snow for the year. Fingers crossed anyway. It's Nebraska and we have received snow as late as May in the past. It's currently about the middle of March, and so this could be the last snow, and I think I'm just going to try to appreciate it today, take the day to stay inside and do some painting. So I'm just going to get things set up here, and for some reason, everything wanted to kind of slip and slide all over the place, so I found a really quick solution for that. Whoops! So I keep my little easel at about a 30-degree angle, and usually that is shallow enough that things don't really slide around too much. So today, let me quick just show you what colors I'll be using for this painting. I'm not going to use very many. I'm using yellow ochre, as you see here, and I needed to fill that up a bit. My Pyrrole red, which I have plenty of that on my palette, so I don't need to worry about that. There it is. And then the only other color I'm using is Payne's Gray, and as usual, I go through quite a lot of it. And I know that it's hard to see, but I do have some white gouache on my palette. It is just to the left of my yellow ochre. There everything goes again, sliding all over the place, so I've got to figure something out. But I do use just a little bit of white gouache at the end. And what I decided to do is use these little grips that help you open jars. And good thing I had a couple of them. One of them is kind of torn up, and I actually use these mostly to open tubes of paint that get stuck sometimes, so I had them handy, thank goodness. Everything just wanted to kind of slide all over the place. So down here on the left lower hand corner, you can see my photo reference, and that's going to be linked below. The actual original photo reference is going to look a little bit different for you because I used my photo editing software just to flip it around and crop it a little bit, and I even rotated it just a little bit to get it the way that I like. But if you check out the original photo reference from pixabay.com that I have linked in the description, you're still going to be able to, see everything that you need, which mostly is just the coloration if you want to go off of that for your own painting. And there will be a template available to you to download and instantly print if you choose to do that. It'll also be linked down in the description. It's basically just going to be my drawing here. I'm using a red Prismacolor colored pencil to do my sketch. And you can see, even though I can't erase with this, I am still freely making little corrections. Like I put that eye up too high, and you can see that I just redrew it a little bit lower where it really should go. And I know in the photo reference that you're seeing on the video, you can't even see the eye because it's very dark and it is in that dark part of the bird. So that's something that, I'm putting into place mostly because what's going to indicate an eye there in the end is just going to be a little bit of highlight where there's light reflecting on the eye. But things like that, I wouldn't say you should even really worry too much about having exactly right. All right, so here I scanned my drawing, so that will be available for you. It'll look just like this. And I'm going to start out with my large flat brush. And I'm new to these brushes. These are synthetic squirrel brushes. And so this is the first time that I'm really using them, and I really do like them. They're called Mimic Squirrel, and Mimic is spelled M-I-M-I-K. I got these from Jerry's Artorama, a set of them, and I really like them. I actually used 3 of the brushes from this line that I bought recently, and I used them for the whole painting, so I just wanted to kind of experiment with those. I want to keep the background very nice and loose. I decided that the area outside of the branches and leaves that the bird is standing on, I'm just going to leave that white. I know it's dark in the photograph, but I decided to just use my discretion there and I decided to leave that white. I felt like that would add a better contrast than going in really dark back there. For the leaves and branches and twigs, I'm leaving those all very, very general. I'm not trying to paint them exactly the way that they are in the photograph. So I'm just basically using some directional strokes to give the indication or impression of foliage, and trying to vary my values quite a bit. And I'm painting wet into wet back here so that things seem pretty soft. I'll have most of my detail in the bird, of course. And so I'm being pretty careful though, just to make sure I leave some lighter areas in that foliage. And I'm also having a lot of fun just kind of dragging this Payne's gray into the bird so that parts of the bird almost seem to merge with the background. And I think that gives kind of a nice, soft, dreamy effect that I really like. And then where the foliage meets just the white of the paper, especially right above the bird, I want to keep that area pretty soft. So now I've finished up with my initial layer of just that Payne's gray, and I'm going to go ahead and start adding some splashes of the yellow ochre onto the bird where I need, and then eventually also onto the background. But I'm keeping things pretty soft, pretty light at this point, because of course with watercolor, our first applications will really start to build up the lightest areas that we'll want to maintain. So I don't want to go in too dark because I want to have lots of room to build up my darks and also to add some texture. And again, in the background, wherever I apply yellow, I'm just keeping it very general. I'm not at all trying to paint every individual leaf. I just want to at least have this texture of foliage back there, but I want to leave everything very soft and very general. So I'm just adding a few splashes of yellow, not worried at all about getting any greens. This painting will have a lot of color harmony to it just by nature of using such a limited palette. So I'm going to do something a little bit maybe experimental, I guess, with that dark head of the bird. Instead of just going in with a lot of Payne's gray, I decided that I would use my Pyrrole red mixed with Payne's gray to create a base layer. And what I'm hoping for here is that as I build up the value in this area and it gets darker, I want just a little bit of this color showing through the darks. And otherwise, I think that this would almost be more of just a two-color painting, and so I'm trying to find a creative way just to incorporate another color into this painting. And because I used that red colored pencil to do my drawing and I'm letting that peek through in just a few areas, I thought that this would be kind of a nice complement to that. But in the end, it will not be super obvious that I used a bunch of red in here. And I'm also adding just a few little strokes of this reddish gray. I guess it's almost a muted violet, even into the darker parts of the wings. And then right up above the bird, I accidentally applied just a little bit of paint onto the white areas. So what I'm doing here is I used my brush with just some water and no pigment and applied that to the little bit of paint that I got outside of the area I meant to put it. And then I used my paper towel just to blot that up as much as possible. But overall, you know, things like that happen, and I don't think it's anything that you necessarily need to worry yourself about too much. Of course, with watercolor, a big part of it is just letting things be. So now I'm going back in with very light glazes of my Payne's gray, because some of these areas, they're a little bit lighter in value, but they're not completely white. So I wanted to apply just a light glaze of that Payne's gray. And now I'm going to start building up the value on the head of the bird. So I'm using Payne's gray, and at this point that muted violet color that I used is dry. So this is not going to be the darkest value I apply. I'm basically just trying to start building up my texture without it looking too flat, and to deepen that value without it looking flat. And I'm also mapping out the lighter areas that I want to reserve in the eye. So if you look at the photo reference, if you open up the link, you'll see that in the eye, there's just a little glint of highlight in there toward the top of the eye. And then there's a little bit of a lighter area just on the outside of the eye that I'm trying to maintain. I know it's a little bit difficult to see in the video. And when I went in there with my muted violet, I really didn't maintain any white at all, because even the highlight is not pure white. So basically at this point, the highlight that I've left in the painting is just going to actually be that muted violet color. But I will go in at the end and just add a little dot of my white gouache just to bring that highlight out a little bit more. And here I'm just being careful to maintain a little bit of the white in the feathers of the wing. And maybe I'm even being just a little bit too cautious on that wing, because I want to maintain those white striations between the feathers on the wing, but I'm also trying to build up a little bit of value there and trying to incorporate that cool Payne's gray. So I felt like I was tiptoeing around that just a little bit, and I don't want to forget about these little legs, so I added some dark Payne's gray just to kind of mark those in. And now I'm going back into the foliage area with a lot of saturated Payne's gray just to add a little bit more depth and variation, using some dry brush, especially in the branches underneath the bird, so that I get a little bit more texture down there. And then here in the back, I just want to darken some of these values and start building up a sense of volume on the body of the bird. And here I'm just using my Payne's gray very, very light, very diluted, to start building up a little bit of texture on the body of the bird. And then here in the background, what I'm going to do is bring out some of the value just a little bit more, and then use some clean water to help that transition be very soft. So right now you can see a very clear definition between the background, but I'm using just some clean water to really dilute that edge so that we get a really soft gradation or transition between where I have pigment and where I want the paper to remain white. And a little bit more fiddling back here. My dogs are snoring as usual. They're taking a little nap. The whole time that I was painting, they were playing and causing a ruckus and kind of driving me crazy. So I'll take the snoring and a little bit of peace for now. And I'm pretty happy with the texture that I have now in the background. So now what I'm going to do is start building up more volume and texture in the body of the bird. So I'm mixing just a little bit of my Payne's gray and my yellow ochre together. And you can see that there's actually two mixes here. There's one that's more heavy on the Payne's gray and one that's heavier toward the yellow ochre. So I'm going to use the yellow ochre with just a little bit of Payne's gray to add a little bit of texture and volume to the lighter areas of the bird where I want the yellow to be more vibrant. And then toward the bottom of the bird's body, I'm using more of the mix that has more Payne's gray and just a little bit of yellow ochre to build up the texture down there. And I don't have much water on my brush at this point, so it's almost a dry brush technique. Sometimes I am blotting my brush off on my paper towel, which is off screen for now. And then I'm using very short, light strokes just to begin to add up some of that texture. And at this point I'm being a little bit more mindful, paying more attention to my photo reference so that I can keep the markings consistent with reality. It's not exactly perfect, but that's, you know, I'm not really going ever for photorealism with my watercolor paintings, but I do want them to remain relatively true to life. And now I'm adding a lot more pigmented Payne's Gray to parts of the bird's head and eye, again, just to help build up texture and value in that area, and a lot of contrast. I especially need a lot of contrast between the dark area and then those few small areas where the feathers are white. And even though I didn't really leave any area on this bird pure white, the contrast between the really dark values and then the relatively lighter values gives the sense that there is white there. And then all I'm going to need to do in those areas in the end is just add a little bit of white gouache, so just some short strokes of white gouache to help build up texture in those lighter areas. And just going in here again with some diluted Payne's Gray with that yellow, just to add a little bit more texture. We're getting pretty close to being done with the watercolor portion of this painting. Just checking things out right there. And so I am just going to go in and brighten up some of the areas that should have a little bit more yellow. So you can see I blotted off my brush onto my paper towel, and I'm using a little bit of dry brush just to add some texture with this bright yellow. I don't want to go overboard. I don't want it to end up being like a cartoon bright yellow, but I do want to add a little bit more splash of color, maybe exaggerate it just a bit from the photo in just a few select areas. And then I'm also using some of that yellow to blend and glaze over some of the grayer areas, because that will help to create kind of an optical blend. And if you have yellow ochre, I'm using M. Graham's brand, and it's actually the only brand of yellow ochre I've ever used. So I'm not sure if this is true of every brand of yellow ochre, but this yellow ochre is fairly translucent, so it's not completely transparent, and it does have a little bit of coverage power over the grays, although it's not completely opaque. And now, just to wrap things up and finalize this painting, I'm adding just a little bit of white gouache to a few select areas. And again, with this white gouache, I'm using kind of a dry brush technique. So there's not much water on my brush, lots of pigment, not much water, and that helps me to apply a little bit of texture over these lighter areas that are meant to be white, but I didn't want them just to be left completely white. So with my watercolor, I went over those areas with very, very light diluted washes. And now I can come in with that white gouache just to add a few dry brush strokes of white, and that helps to create texture even in the white areas. And then I'm going in and just kind of re-emphasizing some of the striations between the feathers on the wing and building up some texture right here under the eye. And then I'll also add a little bit of white gouache to the beak just to create a bit of highlight on the top of the beak. And there we go, I just applied a little bit, just a little dot of white gouache on the eye, just to capture that very small glint of highlight reflecting in the eye. And then there's a few areas on the top of the head where there's just a couple of lighter feathers intermingling into the darker feathers, so I do want to capture those. And I also find that using a little bit of white gouache just on the very outer edge where the form of the bird meets the background, just applying a few strokes of that white gouache there kind of helps to give the bird a little bit more form. Going into the wing just one more time. You can see that where I apply the white gouache, it does fade a little bit. So when I first apply it, it looks really, really white, but as it dries, it fades a bit. So there's going to be a few areas that I want to restate and help them to appear even more white. Being careful, of course, not to overdo it, because I think it can be really easy to, well, with watercolor, it's easy to overdo anything, but I think when you are going in with a little bit of white gouache, it can be tempting to feel like you're going to fix certain aspects of your painting with it. And I advise you to be cautious, because what you can end up with is kind of a milky mess all over your watercolor. And I try to keep in mind that what I love about watercolor is its transparent quality. And using white gouache is more opaque. So I'm only using that in areas that I don't want to maintain that transparent quality. And I'm just adding a few little highlights, a few details, a few accents with the white. But it could be really easy just to go all over the place with this, trying to fix every little, imperfection that I see. So just be really reserved if you're going to use any white gouache to just kind of add back in some white to your painting. All right, so that's it, cleaning up, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Thank you.